The courtroom was silent as the judge glanced over his glasses, eyeing the defendant with a mixture of disdain and amusement. Jake Thompson sat nervously in the defendant's chair, his hands tightly gripping the edge of the table. At 17, he was barely old enough to legally drive, let alone understand the complexities of the legal system he now found himself tangled in. But today, Jake was about to face something much more intimidating than a simple speeding ticket. "Mr. Thompson," Judge Wilson's voice boomed from the bench, breaking the silence. "Do you have a defense for this misunderstanding?" The judge sneered, emphasizing the word misunderstanding, as if the entire situation were laughable. The prosecutor, Samantha Parker, smirked from her position at the front of the courtroom, a picture of professional composure, confident that the case was already decided. Jake swallowed hard. He had always been good at keeping his cool, but today was different. This wasn't some school debate or a friendly argument with friends about who was right and who was wrong. This was real life, and the consequences were very real. But what did they know about him? What did they know about the young man sitting before them? "Your Honor," Jake said, his voice shaking slightly, "I'm not guilty of what you think I did. I was simply standing up for what I believe is right." A murmur passed through the courtroom. It wasn't the first time a teenager had tried to use "standing up for what's right" as a defense, but Jake's words weren't landing the way he hoped. It seemed like everyone in the room had already made up their minds. Judge Wilson leaned forward in his chair, resting his chin on his hand. "Oh, standing up for what's right. And what, pray tell, is right about breaking the law, Mr. Thompson?" He raised an eyebrow, clearly expecting Jake to falter, to back down and accept his fate. Jake's heart pounded. This was not the moment he had imagined when he first got the call to court. He had rehearsed this moment over and over in his head, but now that he was here, the weight of it all was suffocating. "Your Honor," he began again, this time with more confidence. "I'm not trying to excuse my actions. But what happened at that protest wasn't what you think. I was trying to prevent something worse from happening. I know it might sound foolish, but it was the right thing to do." The judge chuckled under his breath, shaking his head. "You see, folks, this is what we get. A young man who believes he knows better than the law, better than those of us who have studied it for years." His voice dripped with sarcasm. "Tell me, Mr. Thompson, what exactly is the law, and how did it apply to your little protest?" The prosecutor, Samantha Parker, leaned over to whisper something to the judge. She didn't even glance in Jake's direction, as if she already knew the outcome. In her mind, this case was a lost cause. She had seen kids like Jake before, rebellious, misguided, looking for a cause to champion but lacking the maturity to understand the consequences of their actions. Jake's face flushed with frustration. This wasn't just about the protest anymore. This was about proving that he wasn't some naive, clueless teenager. He had spent hours, weeks, studying the law, reading case studies, analyzing precedents. He wasn't just spouting off idealistic nonsense. He knew the law, maybe even better than most people in this room, and it was time to show it. He took a deep breath, steadying himself, and then stood up. "Your Honor, if I may," Jake said, his voice now firm and measured. "I'm not claiming to be a legal expert. But I do know that the arrest was unjust. I wasn't just participating in a protest. I was trying to prevent an officer from violating the rights of my fellow citizens. And I have the proof." The room fell silent. Even the judge seemed taken aback by the change in Jake's demeanor. His confident stance was unlike anything they'd seen from him so far. The prosecutor straightened, narrowing her eyes. Was he bluffing? Or was there actually something to this teenager's words? Jake opened the folder he had brought with him, containing all the evidence he had gathered. He placed it on the table in front of him and turned to the judge. "I have a video recording of the incident. It shows the officer acting beyond the scope of his authority, making arrests without just cause." Jake glanced at the prosecutor, then back at the judge. It's all right here, Your Honor. Judge Wilson stared at the papers, his skepticism clear. A video? Really? Are we supposed to believe a teenager, who clearly doesn't understand the law, has somehow stumbled upon evidence that we missed? Let's not kid ourselves, Mr. Thompson. Jake's hands trembled slightly, but he didn't let it show. This was his moment, and he couldn't let it slip away. I'm not asking you to believe me, Your Honor. I'm asking you to look at the facts, to look at the evidence. If I'm wrong, then fine. But if I'm right, then you have to admit that what happened to me was wrong. The judge leaned back in his chair, clearly frustrated. You're walking a fine line here, Mr. Thompson. You're stepping into territory that is beyond your experience, and I suggest you watch yourself. I don't have the patience for games. Jake wasn't sure if the judge was bluffing, or if he was genuinely testing him. But he wasn't about to back down. He had spent far too much time learning about the law to let this moment slip away. Your Honor, Jake said, his voice steady and unwavering, I understand that I'm young. But that doesn't mean I don't deserve a fair hearing. I may not have the experience of a seasoned lawyer, but I do have the facts, and I'm prepared to present them. If you'll give me the chance. For a moment, the room was silent, and Jake felt the weight of every eye on him. It was as if the entire world had paused to see what would happen next. And then, slowly, Judge Wilson spoke again. I'm not sure if you're brave or foolish, Mr. Thompson, he said, his tone now less mocking. But I'll give you one chance to present your case. If you can back up your claims, I'll listen. But don't think for a second that I'm going to make this easy on you. Jake nodded, his heart racing. This was it. He had one chance to prove himself, and he wasn't about to let it slip away. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Jake Thompson wasn't born into a life of privilege. Raised by his mother, Susan Thompson, he had learned early on that life didn't come easy. But he never minded that. In fact, he preferred it. There was something satisfying about figuring things out on his own, not relying on others to solve his problems for him. The world had never handed him anything, and that's how he liked it. If he wanted something, he had to earn it. Growing up in the small town of Oak Ridge, Jake wasn't the most popular kid in school. He didn't have the fancy clothes or the latest sneakers like some of the other kids, but what he did have was a sharp mind and a fierce sense of justice. He wasn't into sports, didn't care for the latest trends, and often found himself on the outside looking in. But that was okay with him. He had his books, his computer, and, most importantly, his legal research. For as long as he could remember, Jake had always been fascinated by the law. It wasn't an easy thing to explain. Most people didn't understand why a teenager would spend his free time reading case studies and legal books instead of hanging out with friends or playing video games. But Jake couldn't help it. There was something about the intricacies of the law, the way it could shape and change lives, that captured his imagination. He would sit in his room for hours, combing through legal websites and historical cases, trying to understand how things worked. His fascination with justice began when he was just a little kid, watching his mom stand up for herself at work, demanding respect and equal treatment from her boss. Susan had always been strong, independent, and fiercely protective of her son. She didn't have a college degree, and she worked multiple jobs to keep their lives afloat, but she never let that stop her from teaching Jake the importance of standing up for what was right. I don't care if they're older, Jake, she would say. If someone's wrong, you stand up and speak the truth. Never let anyone silence you just because you're young or don't have the same fancy degrees they do. You're just as smart, and you have just as much right to be heard. It was from her that Jake learned the most valuable lesson of all, that knowledge was power. And knowledge, when wielded correctly, could change the world. Jake's admiration for his mother only deepened as he grew older, especially when he realized how hard she worked to make sure they both had a roof over their heads, food on the table, and the opportunity for a better life. Despite his mother's constant support, Jake still struggled with the realities of being an outsider. His classmates didn't understand him. To them, Jake was the weird kid who spent all his time in the library, reading books that seemed way too advanced for his age. And when the bullying started, it was relentless. They would mock his glasses, make fun of his quiet nature, and call him a nerd. But Jake didn't care. At least, that's what he told himself. What they didn't understand was that Jake wasn't trying to be different. He didn't go out of his way to stand apart from the crowd. He just was different. His interests didn't line up with theirs, and he wasn't willing to pretend they did just to fit in. Jake wasn't interested in popularity or being the star of the football team. No, what he wanted was something much bigger. He wanted to make a difference. He wanted to understand the system, the way things worked, the way laws were made, and, most importantly, how they could be changed. Jake's only real friend was Tommy, a boy he had met when they were both in 6th grade. Tommy was everything Jake wasn't: outgoing, loud, always in the middle of a crowd, and never afraid to speak his mind. But for some reason, Tommy had always liked Jake. He admired Jake's intelligence, even if he didn't always understand it. And while Jake wasn't the type to go out and party, he'd never turn down a night of pizza and video games with Tommy. In a way, Tommy balanced out Jake's introverted nature, offering him a glimpse into a world of friendships and camaraderie that Jake didn't fully understand but appreciated nonetheless. It was Tommy who had first suggested Jake join the debate club in their freshman year of high school. "You're always right in class, man. Why not put those skills to good use? I bet you'd kill it in debate," Tommy had said, laughing as he tossed a bag of chips at Jake's face. At first, Jake had resisted. Debate was a social activity, and he wasn't sure if he could handle the pressure of public speaking, of standing in front of an audience, and defending a point of view. But Tommy's encouragement was relentless, and after a few weeks of going back and forth, Jake reluctantly agreed to give it a try. It turned out that Tommy was right. Jake's ability to argue logically and back up his points with solid facts made him a natural at debate. He wasn't the most charismatic speaker, but when he spoke, people listened. He didn't rely on flashy speeches or dramatic gestures. Instead, he relied on the power of reason, and it worked. But there was something more to Jake's interest in law and debate. While his peers were concerned with their grades or who they were dating, Jake's mind was consumed by the idea of justice. His parents had instilled in him the belief that life should be fair, that everyone deserved a voice, and that no one, no matter their age, should be silenced. Jake's obsession with justice became more than just a passion, it became a mission. He started studying landmark Supreme Court cases, reading up on constitutional law, and even writing mock briefs on various legal topics. He would spend hours dissecting old cases, analyzing how legal arguments had been made, and learning from the mistakes of past lawyers. His room was filled with law books, case files, and legal journals, his personal library of knowledge. But what no one knew was that Jake had a deep, personal reason for his obsession with the law. It wasn't just the intellectual challenge or the thrill of winning an argument. No, Jake's fascination with justice stemmed from something far more personal, the unresolved issues with his father. His father, who had walked out on their family when Jake was just a toddler, had never been held accountable for his actions. Jake didn't have any memories of him, but the emptiness left in his wake was something Jake could never shake. He had always wondered how someone could just abandon their own family, and he had spent years searching for answers that would never come. It was this need for closure, this desire for justice, that drove Jake forward. He didn't just want to be a lawyer, he wanted to understand the system, to expose the injustices within it, and to make sure that no one else would ever have to feel as abandoned and helpless as he did when his father left. Jake sat in the cold metal chair in the courtroom, his palms clammy as he clutched the edge of the table. He couldn't stop thinking about the night before, the night he had spent preparing for today. He had gone over every single detail of the case, every possible angle he could think of, every piece of evidence he could present. But nothing had prepared him for the way things were unfolding. Judge Wilson's harsh voice still echoed in his mind, "You're walking a fine line here, Mr. Thompson." What had started as a mere protest, a small gathering to raise awareness for a cause he believed in, had spiraled into something much bigger. What began as a peaceful rally had quickly escalated into a scene of chaos, with police officers using excessive force, pushing people to the ground, making arrests without clear justification. Jake had never expected it to come to this. He had thought it was all about making a statement, standing up for people's rights. He had no idea that his actions, his decision to step in when an officer was being too aggressive, would put him on trial. But this wasn't just about Jake anymore. This was about something much larger. It was about holding people accountable for their actions, no matter their position in society. It was about standing up to authority when that authority crossed the line. And Jake knew he had to stick to his guns. Across the courtroom, the prosecutor, Samantha Parker, sat at her table, her eyes narrowed as she studied Jake. She wasn't just trying to win a case, she was trying to make a point. And that point was clear: this teenager didn't stand a chance against the full weight of the law. But there was something about Jake's resolve that bothered her. She could see the fire in his eyes, the confidence that had surfaced when he presented his evidence. She had seen defendants before who were desperate, but Jake wasn't desperate, he was determined. Samantha leaned over to the judge, whispering something that Jake couldn't hear. Judge Wilson nodded, a thin smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Jake knew exactly what they were thinking, that this was just a game, that they were in control, that they would crush him. But that only fueled Jake's resolve. He wasn't going to back down. "I would like to call my first witness, Your Honor," Samantha Parker said, her voice cutting through the tension in the room. Jake's heart skipped a beat. This was it, the moment he had been dreading. Samantha was ready to start presenting her case. She was going to make him look guilty, and if he didn't defend himself well enough, it was over. He had to be ready. It was this need for closure, this desire for justice, that drove Jake forward. He didn't just want to be a lawyer, he wanted to understand the system, to expose the injustices within it, and to make sure that no one else would ever have to feel as abandoned and helpless as he did when his father left. Jake sat in the cold metal chair in the courtroom, his palms clammy as he clutched the edge of the table. He couldn't stop thinking about the night before, the night he had spent preparing for today. He had gone over every single detail of the case, every possible angle he could think of, every piece of evidence he could present. But nothing had prepared him for the way things were unfolding. Judge Wilson's harsh voice still echoed in his mind, "You're walking a fine line here, Mr. Thompson." What had started as a mere protest, a small gathering to raise awareness for a cause he believed in, had spiraled into something much bigger. What began as a peaceful rally had quickly escalated into a scene of chaos, with police officers using excessive force, pushing people to the ground, making arrests without clear justification. Jake had never expected it to come to this. He had thought it was all about making a statement, standing up for people's rights. He had no idea that his actions, his decision to step in when an officer was being too aggressive, would put him on trial. But this wasn't just about Jake anymore. This was about something much larger. It was about holding people accountable for their actions, no matter their position in society. It was about standing up to authority when that authority crossed the line. And Jake knew he had to stick to his guns. Across the courtroom, the prosecutor, Samantha Parker, sat at her table, her eyes narrowed as she studied Jake. She wasn't just trying to win a case, she was trying to make a point. And that point was clear: this teenager didn't stand a chance against the full weight of the law. But there was something about Jake's resolve that bothered her. She could see the fire in his eyes, the confidence that had surfaced when he presented his evidence. She had seen defendants before who were desperate, but Jake wasn't desperate, he was determined. Samantha leaned over to the judge, whispering something that Jake couldn't hear. Judge Wilson nodded, a thin smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Jake knew exactly what they were thinking, that this was just a game, that they were in control, that they would crush him. But that only fueled Jake's resolve. He wasn't going to back down. "I would like to call my first witness, Your Honor," Samantha Parker said, her voice cutting through the tension in the room. Jake's heart skipped a beat. This was it, the moment he had been dreading. Samantha was ready to start presenting her case. She was going to make him look guilty, and if he didn't defend himself well enough, it was over. He had to be ready. The first witness was Officer Grant, the police officer who had been involved in the altercation during the protest. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man, his uniform crisp and perfectly pressed. He took the stand with the air of someone who had seen it all, someone who believed that his version of events was the only truth that mattered. Officer Grant's testimony was as expected. He painted himself as a hero, describing the protest as a violent and chaotic event that needed to be stopped. He spoke with authority, his words dripping with self-assurance as he described how he had been forced to restrain individuals who were becoming belligerent and aggressive. When Samantha asked him to describe Jake's role in the incident, Officer Grant wasted no time. "This young man was among the protesters who refused to disperse," he said, his voice firm and unwavering. "When I attempted to escort him away from the area, he resisted. He argued with me, calling me a puppet of the system. When I tried to make the arrest, he pushed me, attempting to incite further violence." Jake's breath caught in his throat. He had never once pushed anyone, especially not an officer. He had stepped in to help when he saw the officer acting inappropriately, but that wasn't how Officer Grant was presenting it. This was a clear distortion of the truth. "Objection, Your Honor," Jake's attorney, Mr. Lawson, interjected, his voice calm but firm. "The officer's account of the incident is based on his own biased perception. We have evidence that contradicts his claims." Jake's heart raced as he watched the judge's reaction. Judge Wilson gave a sharp nod, signaling for the next part of the trial to continue. "I'd like to submit a video recording of the incident for review, Your Honor," Jake's attorney said, turning toward the judge. A tense silence hung over the room as the prosecutor looked skeptical. She had seen this kind of thing before, defendants thinking they could rely on a video to save them. She wasn't worried. Not yet. But when the video played on the screen, it was clear that the officer's version of events was flawed. The footage showed Jake standing at the edge of the crowd, calmly talking to a few people around him. There was no pushing, no inciting violence. In fact, when the officer approached, Jake had taken a step back, clearly trying to avoid confrontation. But that didn't stop the officer from grabbing him by the arm and pulling him toward the arrest line. The video didn't capture the full altercation, but it was clear enough to show that Jake had been wrongly accused. The room went quiet as the video ended, and all eyes were on Judge Wilson. Even the prosecutor, who had been so sure of her case, seemed taken aback. This wasn't the outcome she had expected. Jake's heart pounded in his chest. The video wasn't a magic bullet. It didn't guarantee anything. But it was a start. It was evidence, and it gave him hope. "Your Honor," Jake's attorney said, standing confidently before the judge, "this video clearly shows that my client was not involved in any aggressive behavior. The officer's actions were unprovoked, and the arrest was made without just cause." Jake could see the shift in the room, the change in the way people were looking at him. This wasn't a case about a rebellious teenager causing trouble. This was a case about a young man who had stood up for what was right, even when it wasn't easy. But even as the video provided a glimmer of hope, Jake knew the hardest part was still to come. He was just getting started, and the battle was far from over. Jake couldn't stop the nerves from eating at him as he sat through the rest of the trial. Every passing minute felt like an eternity. His mind raced, the weight of what was happening sinking in deeper with every word spoken in the courtroom. He had hoped that the video would be enough to tip the scales in his favor, but as the hours dragged on, he realized that wasn't going to be the case. He wasn't just up against the system, he was up against an entire courtroom of people who believed he was nothing more than a rebellious teenager looking to make a name for himself. The prosecutor, Samantha Parker, had launched a scathing cross-examination. She tried to pick apart every word in Jake's defense, every detail of the video, turning it against him. She even tried to discredit his lawyer, Mr. Lawson, by suggesting that they had doctored the footage. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife, and Jake felt the walls closing in around him. But Jake wasn't going to back down. Not now. Not after everything he had worked for. He had come this far, and he was going to finish what he had started. His mother, Susan, sat behind him, her eyes glued to the proceedings. He could feel her presence, her unspoken support pushing him forward. She had always taught him to stand tall, to speak his truth even when it was the hardest thing to do. And right now, that truth was more important than anything. As the prosecutor continued her questioning, Jake's thoughts drifted back to the days leading up to the protest. He remembered the feeling of standing up for something he believed in, the energy of the crowd, the sense of unity as they all chanted together. He thought about the words his mother had said to him, "When you know something is wrong, you don't stay quiet. You fight for what's right, no matter what." That was what had pushed him into action in the first place, the desire to fight for something bigger than himself. He had never intended for things to escalate the way they did, but he wasn't going to let himself be labeled as a criminal just because he had stood up against injustice. The video might not have been a silver bullet, but it was enough to start a ripple. It wasn't just the footage. It was the truth, and that was something the court could no longer ignore. "I'd like to request a brief recess, Your Honor," Mr. Lawson said, breaking the silence that had settled over the room. Judge Wilson nodded, looking over at the clock before turning to the prosecution. "We'll reconvene in 20 minutes. Please be ready to proceed, Mr. Lawson." Jake let out a quiet sigh of relief as the judge dismissed the court. He leaned back in his chair, his hands shaking slightly as he tried to gather his thoughts. He couldn't deny that things were getting harder. The battle was far from over, and Samantha wasn't going to let him off the hook without a fight. But something inside him had shifted. The fear that had gripped him earlier had begun to subside, replaced with a sense of clarity. "Jake, you okay?" Mr. Lawson asked as he approached him, his voice low and steady. Jake nodded, forcing a small smile. "Yeah. Just, overwhelmed, I guess. But I'm ready for whatever comes next." "You've done well so far," Mr. Lawson said, his tone reassuring. "You've stuck to your story, and the video has given us a solid foundation. Now we just need to keep pushing. Don't let them rattle you." Jake nodded again, his resolve hardening. He wasn't in this alone. He had his mother, his lawyer, and even Tommy, who had been texting him non-stop to remind him that he had everything it took to win this fight. They believed in him, and that gave him the strength to believe in himself. As the recess came to an end, Jake stood up and followed Mr. Lawson back into the courtroom. He felt the eyes of everyone on him as he took his seat once again. The moment he sat down, the weight of the trial seemed to press down on him even more. But there was no turning back now. Judge Wilson called the court back to order. "Mr. Lawson, you may proceed." Mr. Lawson stood and adjusted his tie, turning to face the judge and the jury. "Your Honor, members of the jury, we are confident that the evidence we have presented, particularly the video footage, proves that my client, Jake Thompson, was not involved in any aggressive actions during the protest. It is clear that Officer Grant misinterpreted the situation and acted unnecessarily. We request that you consider this evidence when making your decision." Samantha Parker stood up, her voice cutting through the room like a blade. "Your Honor, while the defense would like to paint my client as the villain in this case, the reality is that Jake Thompson instigated the altercation. The video they presented doesn't show the entire incident, and it certainly doesn't show the physicality of the situation that led to his arrest. It's all a carefully constructed narrative, one that we believe will fall apart under closer scrutiny." Jake could feel the tension in the room rising again. Samantha's words were like a cold slap to the face, and he knew that her tactics were working. But he wasn't about to let her manipulate the truth. He had done nothing wrong. He had simply stood up for what was right. He had been the one trying to de-escalate the situation when everything went south. Then, in a moment that took everyone by surprise, Judge Wilson spoke. "I've seen enough," Judge Wilson said, his voice firm. "I believe we have enough evidence to make a decision." Jake's heart leapt into his throat. Was this it? Was he about to find out if everything he had fought for had been in vain? Or was the truth finally going to come to light? Judge Wilson turned to the jury. "Members of the jury, I urge you to consider all the evidence presented today carefully. You must determine whether Jake Thompson's actions were justified or whether he acted unlawfully. I trust you will come to a fair decision." With those words, the courtroom fell into a tense silence. Jake sat on the edge of his seat, his hands clenched together, his mind racing. It was out of his hands now. All he could do was wait. The room was deathly silent as the jury deliberated. Jake could feel the weight of their decision hanging over him, a pressure that seemed to grow with each passing minute. The minutes stretched into hours, and his mind raced with thoughts of what might happen next. He couldn't stop replaying every moment from the trial, every word spoken, every glance exchanged. What if it wasn't enough? What if the jury couldn't see the truth? The uncertainty gnawed at him, but deep down, Jake knew one thing for sure: he had done everything he could. His mother, Susan, sat beside him, her hand resting gently on his shoulder. She hadn't said much since the trial had resumed after the recess, but Jake could feel her presence beside him like a steady anchor. She had been his rock through all of this, never faltering, always reminding him to stay strong. "You've done everything right," she whispered, her voice full of conviction. "I'm so proud of you, Jake. No matter what happens, remember that." Jake nodded, unable to find the right words to express what he was feeling. He was so close to the edge of something huge, something that could change his life forever. The thought of losing now, after all this, felt unbearable. "Your Honor," a voice suddenly called, and the entire room fell still. Jake's heart skipped a beat as the doors to the jury room opened, and the foreman stepped forward, holding the verdict. Jake stood up, his legs feeling like they might buckle under him. He glanced at Mr. Lawson, who was standing next to him, his face unreadable, his eyes fixed on the foreman. Judge Wilson looked at the jury with an expression of calm expectation. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" he asked. The foreman cleared his throat, then nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. We have." Jake's stomach flipped as the foreman stepped forward, handing the slip of paper to the judge. For a moment, it felt as if the world had frozen. The air was thick, charged with the weight of impending judgment. Time seemed to slow as the judge took the paper and began to read the verdict aloud. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Jake Thompson, not guilty of the charges of resisting arrest and assaulting a police officer." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Not guilty. Jake's heart exploded in his chest, and for a brief moment, he could hardly breathe. The rush of relief, of vindication, surged through him like an electric current. He had done it. He had won. The truth had prevailed. His mother let out a choked sob beside him, pulling him into a tight hug. "I knew you would, Jake. I knew you would." Tears welled up in Jake's eyes as he returned the embrace, the overwhelming emotions finally breaking through the dam he had been holding back for so long. The fear, the stress, the uncertainty, it had all melted away in an instant. But as the courtroom erupted into a flurry of activity, people clapping, lawyers shaking hands, the prosecutor's face a mask of frustration, Jake couldn't shake the sense that something bigger had happened. He hadn't just won a court case, he had won a battle for truth, for justice, for the right to stand up against what was wrong. This wasn't just a victory for him, it was a victory for anyone who had ever felt powerless in the face of authority. As Judge Wilson called for order, Jake felt the full weight of what had just happened. He had been tested, pushed to his limits, and yet here he was, standing tall. The fight wasn't over, but for now, Jake knew that he had proven something. He had proven that a single voice, no matter how young or seemingly insignificant, could stand up against the powerful forces of the world. "Congratulations, Jake," Mr. Lawson said, offering him a proud smile. "You did it. You fought for what was right, and you never gave up." Jake smiled back, feeling a warmth spread through him. "I couldn't have done it without you, Mr. Lawson." "Thank you." As they made their way out of the courtroom, Jake caught a glimpse of the prosecutor, Samantha Parker, standing at her table, her arms crossed. Her expression was stoic, but there was something different about her, something Jake couldn't quite place. Maybe it was respect. Maybe it was frustration. Or maybe, just maybe, she realized that this wasn't the end. This case had been a small chapter in a much larger story. "Hey," a voice called from behind, and Jake turned to see Tommy approaching with a big grin on his face. "I knew you'd pull through, man. You've got this crazy ability to turn everything around when it seems impossible." Jake laughed, a real laugh, and he clapped his friend on the back. "Yeah, well, it wasn't easy. But I guess I had some pretty good people in my corner." Tommy raised an eyebrow. "Yeah, but you were the one who stayed in the ring. That's what counts." Jake's smile faded slightly as he glanced back at the courtroom doors, his thoughts drifting. The victory felt sweet, but the weight of the journey lingered. He had been to hell and back, and while he had won, it wasn't just the verdict that had changed him. The whole experience, everything he had learned, everything he had faced, had transformed him in ways he hadn't even realized until now. As they walked down the courthouse steps together, Jake felt a sense of resolve settle deep in his chest. He had come this far, and he wasn't about to stop. The world was filled with challenges, injustices, and obstacles. But now, Jake knew something for certain: he could face them all. He had a fire inside him that nothing could extinguish. The sun shone brightly as Jake stepped out into the open, the wind catching his hair and lifting his spirits. He had won this fight, but the fight for justice, for truth, was far from over. And Jake was ready for whatever came next. Jake leaned back in the passenger seat of his mother's car, the noise of the city rushing past him as they made their way home. The victory in court still felt surreal. He had spent so many sleepless nights wondering if he would be able to escape the shadow of that arrest, if the truth would ever be enough to save him. Now, as the courthouse faded into the background, he couldn't help but feel like something profound had shifted within him. His mother was driving, her hands gripping the steering wheel with a calmness that belied the emotions she must have been feeling. Every now and then, she'd glance over at him, a soft smile on her lips, but she didn't speak right away. She didn't need to. The silence between them was comfortable. After everything they had gone through, the words weren't necessary. Jake's phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him out of his thoughts. He pulled it out and saw the message from Tommy. "Tommy, so, now that you're free, what's next? Going to take a break or go after bigger things?" Jake chuckled, tapping out a reply. "Jake, one battle at a time, man. I think I need some time to breathe." He put the phone down, his thoughts drifting back to the trial. Despite the victory, something still gnawed at him, a sense that the war wasn't over. The court case had been a single, important chapter, but Jake knew that his fight for justice wasn't finished. It wasn't just about proving he was innocent. It was about exposing the truth to the world and making sure that this never happened again to anyone else. His mind went back to the prosecutor, Samantha Parker. The way she had carried herself during the trial, the sharp edge to her voice, the way she had tried to tear apart every part of his story. Jake didn't hate her. She was doing her job, after all. But something about her made him wonder if there was more to her than what he had seen in court. His thoughts were interrupted when his mother spoke up, her voice soft but full of meaning. You did something amazing today, Jake, Susan said, her eyes briefly meeting his before focusing back on the road. But you know, the truth is, what you did was more than just standing up in court. It was standing up for what's right, even when it wasn't easy. Jake nodded, feeling a wave of emotion flood over him. Yeah, I know. But, it wasn't just me. I didn't do it alone, Mom. There were so many people who helped me get through this. Mr. Lawson, Tommy, you. Without you guys, I don't think I would have made it. His mother smiled, her voice tinged with a mixture of pride and love. You're stronger than you think. You always have been. Jake stared out of the window, the familiar streets of their neighborhood beginning to look different to him. He wasn't the same person who had walked into that courtroom a few days ago. He had faced his fears, confronted his doubts, and emerged stronger for it. But he couldn't help but feel that there was a deeper lesson here, one that he had yet to fully understand. When they arrived home, Jake stepped out of the car and followed his mother into the house. The air was thick with a sense of finality, yet it felt like the calm before the storm. He had made it through the trial, but now what? What did life look like after all the chaos? He sank onto the couch, kicking off his shoes and running a hand through his hair. His mother came over, setting a cup of tea down on the coffee table in front of him. Rest up, Jake, she said softly. You've earned it. We'll figure out what's next when you're ready. Jake nodded, but his thoughts were already moving forward. He had won the case, but that wasn't the end of his journey. There were bigger issues at play, and he had a newfound sense of purpose. His victory in court had shown him the power of standing up for what's right. But it also showed him how much more needed to be done. His mind flashed back to the protest, the anger in the streets, the people who felt silenced and overlooked. Jake realized that he couldn't just sit back now that the trial was over. This experience had lit a fire inside him, a fire to make a real difference. To go beyond just one protest, beyond just one case, and push for real change. Jake stood up abruptly, startling his mother, who was seated nearby. I think I know what I need to do next, he said, his voice resolute. His mother looked up, concern flickering in her eyes. What do you mean? I've been thinking about it, Jake said, pacing back and forth. This wasn't just about me. It was about everyone who's been treated unfairly. People need to know that they're not alone, that they have the power to stand up too. I need to keep fighting, not just for myself, but for them. His mother stood up slowly, watching him with a knowing look. Jake, are you sure? It's going to be hard. You've just been through something intense, and I don't want you to rush into anything before you're ready. Jake took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her words. He knew what she meant. It had been an exhausting, emotional ride, and jumping back into the fight might seem reckless. But he couldn't ignore the feeling in his chest, the urgency, the need to do more. I don't want to be reckless, Jake replied, his voice steady. But I also can't sit on the sidelines anymore. I know there's more to this than just my case. Susan took a moment before nodding slowly. All right. But promise me you'll take it one step at a time. Don't burn yourself out. I promise, Jake said, a small smile tugging at his lips. He knew his mother was worried. She had always been protective of him, ever since he was a kid. But Jake felt a sense of conviction that he couldn't ignore. It was time to take the lessons he'd learned, the courage he had found, and channel it into something bigger than himself. The journey wasn't over. It had only just begun. Jake sat at the kitchen table, scrolling through his phone absent-mindedly. His thoughts kept returning to the same question, what now? He had been a regular teenager just a few months ago, not much different from anyone else. But after the trial, everything had changed. The victory, as sweet as it was, felt like the beginning of something far bigger than he ever imagined. His phone buzzed again, snapping him out of his daze. This time it was a message from Tommy. Tommy, man, you've been quiet. What are you thinking? Are you okay? Jake paused for a moment before typing back. Jake, I'm good, just thinking about the next step. I can't just sit back. I feel like I need to do more. He stared at the message for a while, unsure of how to explain it. How could he put into words the fire that had been ignited inside him? How could he explain that, after everything he had gone through, he couldn't rest until he had made a bigger impact? Tommy's reply came almost instantly. Tommy, I get it. You've been through hell, man. But don't dive in head first. You just survived a massive battle. Give yourself time to breathe. You've earned it. Jake chewed on Tommy's words, but deep down, he knew that he couldn't rest. The truth was, the fight wasn't over. Not by a long shot. His case had been one instance in a larger system, and he couldn't ignore all the other stories that had yet to be heard. He set his phone down and stood up, pacing the room. His mom, who had been quietly reading in the living room, heard his footsteps and came to check on him. Everything okay? She asked, a hint of concern in her voice. Jake stopped, meeting her gaze. I can't just sit here, Mom. There's too much at stake. I've learned so much from this, about the system, about what's wrong, about what needs to change. I can't ignore that. Susan sat down beside him. Jake, I know how much this means to you. But don't rush into anything. It's easy to get caught up in the emotions of everything you've just been through. You need to think this through. Jake took a deep breath. I know. I've been thinking a lot. And I've decided. I want to get involved in reform. I don't want to just be a one-off case. I want to help people who are going through what I went through. People who don't have a voice. People who feel helpless. Susan looked at him, a mixture of pride and worry in her eyes. Jake, that's a big commitment. You've seen how complicated things can get. The system isn't always going to make it easy. I know, Jake said, his voice determined. But I have to do something. I can't just sit back and pretend everything is fine when I know it's not. Susan sighed and placed a hand on his shoulder. I know you've got the heart for this, Jake. Just promise me you'll take it one step at a time. Don't burn yourself out. Jake nodded, but deep inside, he knew his heart was set on this new path. He had been tested, and he had come out stronger for it. He had faced down an entire system in that courtroom and walked away victorious. What else could be scarier than that? The next few days were a whirlwind. Jake began researching organizations that were working on criminal justice reform. He read articles, watched documentaries, and even reached out to people who had been involved in similar causes. The more he learned, the more he realized just how vast the issue was. It wasn't just about police brutality, it was about an entire system that too often left people behind, people who didn't have the resources or the support to fight back. Jake started putting together a plan. He wasn't sure exactly where to start, but he knew one thing: he needed to share his story. The public needed to hear about what he had gone through, what had happened to him, and how things needed to change. His story wasn't just his own, it was the story of thousands of others who had been unjustly treated. He called Tommy later that afternoon to fill him in on what he had been working on. I've been doing a lot of research, Jake said, pacing around the kitchen as he spoke. There's so much out there, man. People are talking about reform, but it's still so far from where it needs to be. I think I could help make a difference, even if it's small to start with. Tommy's voice came through the phone, steady and reassuring. I'm proud of you, Jake. You've got the passion and the drive. But you've got to pace yourself. Don't dive in too deep right away. Make sure you're taking care of yourself in the process. I know, Jake replied, stopping to lean against the counter. But I just feel like if I don't do something, then what was the point of everything I've been through? I didn't go through that trial just to walk away and forget about it. Tommy was silent for a moment. You're right, man. But don't forget that there's more to this than just your story. There are so many other people who need help too. Jake nodded, the weight of Tommy's words settling in. He wasn't alone in this fight. There were countless other voices that needed to be heard. That evening, Jake sat down to write an open letter. He wasn't sure exactly who would read it, but he needed to get his thoughts out. The words flowed from him easily, as if his heart were dictating every sentence. Dear world. I've been through a lot. I've seen how broken the system can be, and I've felt what it's like to be on the receiving end of injustice. But I'm here to tell you that it doesn't have to be this way. We can do better. We have to do better. I'm just one person, one story. But I believe that together, we can make a difference. If you're out there, feeling like your voice doesn't matter, I want you to know that it does. You are not alone. We can fight for a system that treats everyone equally, no matter their background or who they are. This is just the beginning. Jake Thompson. Jake sat back after finishing the letter, feeling a strange sense of peace. For the first time in a long time, he knew what he needed to do. It wouldn't be easy, but nothing worth fighting for ever was. Jake woke up the next morning with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. His alarm blared through the quiet of his room, but he didn't hit the snooze button. He had no time for that today. There was work to do. He grabbed his phone from the nightstand, already thinking about the open letter he'd written the night before. After a few minutes of scrolling through social media, he saw that the post had already begun to make waves. People were liking, sharing, and commenting on it. Some of the comments were supportive, others critical, but all of them acknowledged one thing: Jake's voice was being heard. His mom knocked lightly on his door, sticking her head in. "Jake, are you getting up? You've got a busy day ahead." Jake smiled at her as he got out of bed. "Yeah, I'm up. I've got a lot of plans today." His mother raised an eyebrow. "Plans? Care to share what they are?" Jake paused, considering how to explain. The truth was, he wasn't entirely sure himself. He had no concrete plan, no blueprint for how to take his passion and turn it into real change. But he knew he had to start somewhere. "I'm going to meet with a few people. I've got some ideas for getting involved in criminal justice reform, and I'm hoping they can help me figure out how to make it happen." Susan gave him a long look, her concern still evident. "Jake, I know this means a lot to you. But don't rush into anything. Take it slow. You've just been through a lot, and I want to make sure you're really ready for this." Jake nodded, appreciating his mom's concern, but he couldn't deny the fire burning inside him. "I understand, Mom. But I've been thinking about it, and I can't sit back. I've got to do something. I've already seen so many people who are in worse situations than I was. If I can do something to help, then I have to try." Susan studied him for a moment before sighing softly. "All right, Jake. Just promise me you'll be careful." "I will," Jake said with a grin, grabbing his bag. "I'll take care of myself. Don't worry." His first stop of the day was a community center in the heart of the city. He had read about them online, a group of activists and lawyers who had been working on criminal justice issues for years. Jake had reached out to them a few days ago, and they had agreed to meet with him to hear his story. As he walked into the building, he felt a nervous flutter in his stomach. This wasn't like the courtroom. This wasn't some legal battle he could strategize for. This was real, raw work. The people in this building weren't just interested in his case, they were focused on long-term solutions for people who had been hurt by the system. It felt like a different world altogether. A woman in her 30s, dressed casually but confidently, greeted him at the door. "Jake?" she asked, extending her hand. "Yeah, that's me," he replied, shaking her hand. "You must be Rachel." She nodded. "It's great to meet you. Come on in. We have a lot to talk about." She led him into a small conference room, where two other people were sitting. One was an older man with graying hair, wearing glasses, and the other was a young woman around his age, who looked like she was working on a stack of papers. Rachel introduced everyone. "This is David, a criminal defense attorney who's been working with us for years, and this is Clara. She works with our advocacy group, focusing on policy change and public outreach." Jake shook their hands, feeling slightly out of place. But Rachel's smile was warm and inviting, and she made him feel more comfortable as she sat down across from him. "All right, Jake, tell us your story," she said. "We want to know why you're here and what you want to do next." Jake took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts. It wasn't easy to talk about everything again, the arrest, the trial, the way he had been treated by the system. But this was different. These people weren't here to judge him. They were here to listen, to help. He began to speak, and as the words left his mouth, he realized just how much he had changed since the day he had first stepped into that courtroom. He spoke not just about the trial, but about the injustice he had seen, about the way the system failed him, and so many others. He spoke of the faces he had seen in the courthouse, the stories he had heard from people who had never been given a chance. By the time he finished, there was a heavy silence in the room. Rachel, David, and Clara exchanged looks, their expressions thoughtful. Finally, Rachel spoke. "You're not the only one who's been through something like this, Jake. But hearing it from someone your age, someone who's actually gone through it, really brings it to light. We need more voices like yours in this fight." David nodded in agreement. "This is bigger than just one case. This is about shining a light on the brokenness of the system. People like you, people who've lived it, have the power to make a real difference." Clara, who had been quiet up until now, added, "We've been pushing for criminal justice reform for years, but having someone like you step up could change the game. You've got credibility, Jake. You've been there. You're not just an outsider looking in. You're one of us." Jake felt a wave of pride wash over him. It was one thing to believe in something, it was another entirely to have others believe in you. These people didn't just see him as a victim of the system, they saw him as an ally, a potential leader in a much bigger fight. Rachel leaned forward, her eyes focused. "We have a few projects in mind that could use your voice. Public speaking, writing, even getting involved in local protests. We want to amplify your story, but we need to do it in a way that builds momentum, not just for you but for everyone who's been affected." Jake nodded. "I'm in. Whatever it takes." As Jake left the community center later that afternoon, his heart was pounding with excitement. He hadn't expected such an overwhelming response, but the words of Rachel, David, and Clara stuck with him. They believed in him. They thought his voice could make a difference. And for the first time since his trial, Jake truly believed it too. He had taken his first step toward making change. It wasn't going to be easy. It was going to take time, effort, and a lot of patience. But he was ready for it. The fight was bigger than one courtroom victory. The fight was for everyone who had been ignored, mistreated, or silenced. And Jake Thompson was ready to be their voice. The next few weeks passed in a blur. Jake was no longer just the teenager who had stood up in court and outsmarted a judge. He was becoming an advocate, a symbol for criminal justice reform, a voice for those who had been silenced for too long. His days were filled with meetings, interviews, and phone calls. He was no longer just living his life had become a movement. But with all this change came a new set of challenges. The pressure was mounting, and Jake could feel the weight of it settling on his shoulders. It started to sink in that his story was no longer just about him. It had become something larger, something that he couldn't control. He had agreed to speak at rallies, to attend conferences, to meet with people who were ready to put him on a pedestal. But every time he stepped in front of a camera, every time he stood up at a podium, the expectation grew heavier. "Jake, are you ready for this? Rachel asked him one evening after they'd wrapped up a call about his next speaking engagement. Her tone was caring but firm, as if she could sense the stress building up behind his calm exterior. "I think so," Jake replied, but even to his own ears, his voice lacked conviction. He had been running on adrenaline for weeks, but now, with the momentum he had built, he was beginning to question whether he could keep it up. Rachel was perceptive enough to notice the crack in his confidence. She leaned in, her eyes narrowing slightly as she studied him. "Listen, I know it feels like everything is happening fast. But I want to make sure you don't burn out before the real work even begins. You don't have to do everything. One step at a time, Jake. It's okay to take a break when you need to." Jake rubbed his temples, feeling a headache coming on. "I just feel like if I take a step back, people will think I'm not serious about this. Like I'm just some kid who got lucky with his trial and now I'm fading into the background." Rachel sighed softly, leaning back in her chair. "Jake, you're not fading into the background. And nobody thinks you got lucky. You've earned every bit of this. But it's okay to pace yourself. It's okay to say no sometimes. You've got a long road ahead of you." Jake nodded, but in the pit of his stomach, he couldn't shake the fear that if he didn't keep pushing forward, the momentum he had gained would slip through his fingers. He had worked so hard to get here, and the idea of stepping back, even for a moment, felt like losing everything he had fought for. Later that night, as Jake lay in bed, he stared at the ceiling, trying to quiet the whirlwind in his mind. It wasn't just the pressure that weighed on him. It was the fear. The fear of letting down the people who had believed in him, the fear of not being able to make a real difference, and the fear of failing those who had been counting on him to make things right. But then, something occurred to him. This wasn't just about the people he was trying to help. It was about him, too. He couldn't fix everything, and he couldn't carry the world on his shoulders. The weight was too heavy for one person to bear alone. He grabbed his phone from the nightstand and sent a quick message to Tommy. "Jake, I need to talk to you. Something's off." Tommy's reply came quickly. "Tommy, of course, man. What's going on?" Jake thought for a moment before typing out his response. "Jake, I'm feeling the pressure. I've been on this roller coaster for weeks now, and I'm scared I'm gonna crash if I don't slow down. But I don't know how to stop." Tommy's reply was supportive, as always. "Tommy, I get it, man. You've been going hard, and it's exhausting. But remember, you're not in this alone. You've got people who have your back. Don't be afraid to lean on them when you need to." Jake let out a slow breath, feeling a weight lift just a little. He hadn't realized how much he had been holding on to, trying to prove something to everyone, especially himself. But Tommy was right. He didn't have to do it all alone. The next day, Jake decided to take Rachel's advice. He cancelled one of his upcoming speaking engagements and spent the afternoon at the local park, sitting under a tree, letting his mind wander. It was the first time in weeks that he wasn't rushing from one commitment to the next. It felt strange, but also peaceful. As he sat there, Jake's thoughts turned to his past. He thought about the trial, the judge, the people who had tried to break him. But most of all, he thought about the person he was becoming. He was no longer just a kid who had been thrown into a broken system. He was someone who had the power to change it. But it wasn't going to happen overnight. And it wasn't going to happen by taking on the world all at once. Jake took a deep breath, feeling the warmth of the sun on his skin. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he could breathe again. That evening, Jake sat down with his mom at the kitchen table. He told her about the pressure he'd been feeling, the fear of not being enough, and the doubts that had been creeping into his mind. Susan listened carefully, her eyes full of understanding. "You don't have to be perfect, Jake. You just have to be real. You've already done something incredible. You've already shown that one person can make a difference. But you don't have to do it all at once. You can take your time. Jake smiled at her, grateful for her wisdom. Thanks, Mom. I think I needed to hear that. As the conversation shifted to lighter topics, Jake couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. He had taken the first step in acknowledging the weight he was carrying, and it had already made him feel more in control. The path ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in a while, he felt ready to face it, one step at a time. Jake's decision to slow down had given him the clarity he needed, but it didn't mean his work was over. He knew that the battle for justice would be long and hard. And despite his moment of peace at the park, he still felt the weight of his mission pressing on his chest. He couldn't stop. He wouldn't stop. There were too many people counting on him. Over the next few days, he returned to his routine of meetings, research, and planning. However, things began to take an unexpected turn. One afternoon, while he was waiting for a call from Rachel about a new initiative, Jake received a surprising email. It was from Judge Nathaniel Warner, the very same judge who had ridiculed him during his trial. The subject line made his stomach twist, a request for a meeting. Jake stared at the email, unsure of what to make of it. He had never expected to hear from the judge again, let alone be asked for a meeting. He wondered if the judge wanted to apologize for his behavior in court, but something about it felt off. He clicked the email open. Dear Jake Thompson. I hope this message finds you well. I would like to request a meeting with you to discuss your recent activities in criminal justice reform. While I admit that my initial interactions with you in the courtroom were far from ideal, I have been following your efforts and believe that your voice could play a significant role in reshaping the way we approach justice in this country. I understand if you are hesitant, given our past history. However, I think it could be beneficial for both of us to discuss this matter further. If you're open to it, I would like to meet in person to explore how we might work together to create meaningful change. Sincerely, Judge Nathaniel Warner. Jake blinked, rereading the email several times. This had to be a joke, right? There was no way the judge who had humiliated him in court was now suddenly interested in supporting him. But as much as the email felt strange, there was one thing Jake knew for certain: he couldn't let fear or pride stop him from exploring any possibility of change, even if it came from the least expected place. The judge might have been cruel during the trial, but perhaps he had changed. Perhaps he had come to realize that Jake's cause was more important than his ego. Jake quickly typed a response. Dear Judge Warner. Thank you for your message. I must admit, I'm surprised by your request, but I appreciate your willingness to engage. I'm open to meeting with you to discuss how we might work together for the betterment of the justice system. Please let me know when you would be available. Best regards. Jake Thompson. He hit send, still uncertain about the meeting. A part of him felt that it might be a waste of time, perhaps just a way for the judge to save face after all that had happened. But another part of him knew that if there was a chance for change, even in the most unlikely of circumstances, he had to explore it. The next day, Jake received a reply from Judge Warner, confirming the meeting for the following Monday morning. Jake couldn't help but feel a mix of apprehension and curiosity. What could this meeting possibly be about? Was the judge truly interested in supporting him, or was he trying to manipulate the situation for his own benefit? When Monday arrived, Jake dressed carefully, making sure to look professional but not overly formal. He didn't want to come off as too eager or naive. As he walked into the courthouse, he couldn't help but feel the weight of the place, the walls that had once been a battleground, now standing as silent witnesses to the strange turn his journey had taken. He walked up to the judge's office, took a deep breath, and knocked lightly on the door. A voice from inside called out, "Come in." Jake stepped inside and was greeted by Judge Warner, who was sitting behind a large, polished desk. The judge was older than Jake remembered, with a deep furrow on his brow and a weary look in his eyes. Despite the tension in the air, there was no sign of the arrogance or disdain Jake had come to associate with the man. Instead, he looked, almost human. Jake, Judge Warner said, rising from his chair. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me. Please, have a seat." Jake hesitated for a moment before sitting down across from him. The silence that followed was uncomfortable, but eventually, Judge Warner spoke. "I want to begin by acknowledging the way I treated you in court," the judge said, his voice uncharacteristically soft. "Looking back, I realize I was wrong. I let my pride and my position cloud my judgment. And for that, I am truly sorry." Jake was taken aback. He had not expected this kind of apology, and for a moment, he didn't know how to respond. Part of him wanted to lash out, to remind the judge of how much he had hurt him, how much his words had affected him. But another part of him, perhaps the part that had grown over the past few weeks, understood that this moment was bigger than the past. "I appreciate your apology," Jake said carefully. "But I don't think an apology is enough to fix what's broken in the system." Judge Warner nodded. "You're right. An apology alone won't change anything. But I think it's a step in the right direction." The judge leaned forward, his hands clasped in front of him. "Jake, I've been thinking a lot about the criminal justice system, about what you've been doing. And I've come to the realization that the system needs reform, real reform. I've seen how it's failed so many people, including you. And I want to be a part of changing it." Jake studied him, trying to read the sincerity in his eyes. Could this be real? Was the judge truly ready to change, to fight for justice after everything that had happened? "I'm not here to tell you that everything will be easy, or that I have all the answers," Judge Warner continued. "But I believe that together, we can make a real impact. I want to help support your cause, Jake. I know my reputation may be a barrier, but I'm willing to use my position and my voice to amplify yours. To help make the changes we both know are necessary." Jake sat in stunned silence. This was the last thing he had expected, an ally in the very man who had tried to break him. But as he looked into Judge Warner's eyes, he could see the sincerity in his expression. It wasn't about saving face anymore. It was about something deeper, something that Jake couldn't ignore. "I'm willing to give this a chance," Jake said, his voice steady. "But it's going to take more than just words. It's going to take real action." Judge Warner nodded. "I understand. And I'm ready to take those steps with you." As Jake left the courthouse later that day, he felt a strange sense of hope. The road ahead would still be difficult, and there would be many challenges to face. But in that moment, Jake realized that sometimes, the most unlikely alliances could bring about the greatest change. And perhaps, just perhaps, Judge Warner was the first step towards something bigger than either of them had imagined. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The days that followed the meeting with Judge Warner were filled with uncertainty. Jake had agreed to work with the judge, but there was still a part of him that wondered whether this unexpected partnership was a good idea. Could he really trust someone who had once ridiculed him in court? Was this a genuine attempt at change, or just an attempt at damage control? Despite these questions lingering in his mind, Jake knew that he couldn't afford to be skeptical. The judge, despite his past actions, was in a unique position to help make real change in the justice system. If he truly wanted to help, Jake wasn't about to turn his back on the opportunity. Judge Warner's office became their headquarters for their collaboration. They began meeting regularly to discuss the specifics of criminal justice reform, strategizing about what they could do together to raise awareness, change laws, and challenge the status quo. At first, Jake was cautious. He watched the judge closely, trying to read his intentions. But over time, he began to see a side of Warner he had never noticed before. The judge was driven, passionate about reform in a way Jake hadn't expected. It wasn't just about redemption for the judge's past mistakes, it was about making a difference. And slowly but surely, Jake began to believe that the judge wasn't just doing this to repair his image. Their first project together was to create a petition calling for more transparency in the judicial system, specifically within sentencing practices. They gathered data on racial disparities, the overrepresentation of minorities in the prison system, and the disproportionate lengths of sentences for nonviolent offenses. The petition quickly gained traction, with thousands of signatures from concerned citizens, activists, and legal professionals. The media started paying attention, too. Journalists began reaching out for interviews with Jake and Judge Warner. At first, the public was skeptical of their partnership, questioning the authenticity of the judge's involvement. But as they saw the genuine passion in both of them, the tide began to turn. People were starting to believe that this was more than just a publicity stunt, it was a real movement, backed by both a young man who had faced the system's flaws firsthand and a judge who now recognized the system's failures. One afternoon, as they sat in the judge's office, Jake couldn't help but feel a sense of accomplishment. The petition had gained over 50,000 signatures, and they had started getting calls from lawmakers interested in meeting to discuss potential reforms. Jake felt like they were making progress, like the dream of a better justice system was within reach. "Jake," Judge Warner said, interrupting his thoughts. "We've made some real progress, but we need to take the next step. We need to get in front of Congress. We need to speak directly to lawmakers and show them why this change is essential." Jake looked at him, unsure. "You really think we can get them to listen?" Judge Warner nodded. "If we don't try, we'll never know. We have momentum now. People are paying attention. This is our chance to bring about real change." Jake felt the pressure building again. Speaking in front of Congress was a monumental step. This wasn't just about making a statement anymore. It was about changing the law. It was about ensuring that the voices of those who had been ignored for so long finally got heard. "I'm in," Jake said, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions swirling inside him. "We can't let this slip away. Let's do it." The next few weeks were a blur of preparation. They spent hours putting together a presentation, working with legal experts and activists to craft the most compelling argument they could. Jake had to brush up on his public speaking skills, something he hadn't thought he'd need when he first set foot in that courtroom months ago. But now, he was being asked to speak before some of the most powerful lawmakers in the country. As the day of the congressional meeting approached, Jake felt a mixture of nerves and excitement. He was about to do something that could change the course of history. But it wasn't just about him anymore. It was about everyone who had been affected by the broken system. It was about all those who had never had a voice. The morning of the meeting, Jake woke up early, trying to focus on the task at hand. He had prepared for this moment in every way he could think of, but now it was time to face the reality. He stood in front of the mirror in his hotel room, straightening his suit jacket. He hardly recognized the person staring back at him. This wasn't the same kid who had walked into court months ago, unsure of his place in the world. No, this was someone who had found his purpose, someone who was ready to fight for what was right. He met Judge Warner in the lobby of the hotel, and together, they headed to the Capitol. The room where they were set to speak was filled with lawmakers, legal experts, and activists. The atmosphere was tense, charged with anticipation. Jake could feel the weight of the moment, but he also felt something else. He felt the power of his voice. He wasn't just standing there as a young man who had been wronged, he was standing there as someone who could make a difference. When it was their turn to speak, Judge Warner began, his voice calm and steady as he addressed the room. He spoke about the flaws in the system, the biases in sentencing, and the lives that had been ruined by policies that didn't work. His words were powerful, but it was when Jake stood up to speak that the room truly took notice. Jake's heart pounded in his chest, but his voice was steady as he spoke about his own experiences, about being a teenager who had been mistreated by the justice system, about the struggle to rise above the hatred and judgment that had been thrown his way. He spoke about the hope that had fueled his journey, the belief that things could get better if they just had the courage to change. The room was silent when he finished. Jake could feel the weight of their eyes on him, and for a moment, he wasn't sure if the silence was a good thing or a bad thing. But then, one by one, the lawmakers began to applaud. It was quiet at first, but then the applause grew louder, stronger. They had listened. They had heard him. And that was the first step. After the meeting, Jake and Judge Warner stood outside the Capitol building, both of them feeling the weight of what had just happened. "We did it," Jake said, his voice full of disbelief. "We did," Judge Warner replied, a small smile tugging at his lips. "But this is just the beginning. We've got a long way to go." Jake nodded. "I know. But we're on the right track." After the congressional hearing, Jake felt a surge of optimism. He had spoken his truth, and lawmakers had listened. It seemed like a victory, one that would mark the beginning of the massive reforms they had been pushing for. But the reality of political change was far more complicated than Jake had anticipated. The road ahead wasn't going to be as easy as he'd hoped. In the days following the hearing, there was a flurry of media coverage. The petition had gained more traction, and the public was increasingly supportive of the cause. But with the increased attention came heightened opposition. Conservative groups, legal professionals with vested interests in maintaining the status quo, and even some of Jake's own allies started to voice concerns about the reforms they were pushing. The first sign that the fight wasn't over came when Judge Warner received an anonymous letter, warning him about the consequences of continuing his support for Jake. It was written in harsh, threatening language, warning that his career could be ruined if he continued down this path. The letter claimed that Jake was being used as a pawn, and that any real change would only serve to weaken the justice system. The letter wasn't the only attack. Jake's social media accounts were flooded with messages of hate and doubt. People who had once supported him now questioned his motives, calling him naive and accusing him of working with a judge who was just trying to save his reputation. Some even claimed that Jake was simply seeking attention, rather than truly trying to make a difference. Judge Warner, though shaken by the threats, didn't back down. He had been through political battles before and understood that those who pushed for real change would always face opposition. But Jake had never experienced anything like this before. The hate, the doubts, the constant barrage of negativity, it felt overwhelming at times. He questioned whether he was truly cut out for this fight. One morning, while meeting with Rachel, Jake voiced his concerns. "I thought we were doing something good. I thought people were finally hearing us, but now it feels like everyone's turning against us." Rachel, who had been by his side through the entire journey, placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Jake, this is exactly what happens when you challenge the system. People who benefit from the status quo are always going to try to tear you down. Don't let them distract you. You've come so far, and you've already made a huge impact. This is just a bump in the road." Jake appreciated her words, but the doubt still lingered in the back of his mind. He had come so far, but he wondered if it was enough. Could they really change anything? Or was it all just a dream? Despite the growing pressure, Jake knew he couldn't stop now. He had to push forward, for the people who were counting on him, for the countless others who had been forgotten by the system. But he also knew he couldn't do it alone. He needed the support of those who truly believed in the cause. It was at this moment that Rachel suggested an idea, a risky one, but one that could help bring more attention to their movement. "What if we go directly to the people? We could hold a series of public forums, town halls where people can come and speak about their experiences with the justice system. It would show that this isn't just about us, it's about everyone who's been hurt by the system." Jake thought about it. The idea had potential, but it was a gamble. Public forums could attract a large crowd, but it could also invite more of the backlash they had been receiving. The people who disagreed with their reforms might show up, too, making it harder to get their message across. But the more Jake considered it, the more he realized that this was exactly what they needed. They needed to give the people a platform to share their stories. They needed to create a space where the truth could be heard, loud and clear. "We'll do it," Jake said, his voice firm. "We'll start the forums. We're not backing down. We can't afford to." The first public forum was scheduled for the following week in a community center in a city known for its high incarceration rates. The event was open to everyone, activists, lawmakers, and citizens who had been affected by the justice system. The idea was simple: provide a space for real stories and discussions about the flaws in the system, while also providing a platform for potential solutions. On the day of the forum, Jake and Rachel arrived early to set up. There was an air of nervous anticipation in the room. The organizers had no idea how many people would show up, but they were hoping for a strong turnout. By the time the event was ready to begin, the room was filled with people from all walks of life: families of incarcerated individuals, ex-convicts trying to rebuild their lives, legal professionals, and ordinary citizens who had been affected by the system in one way or another. Jake took a deep breath as he stepped onto the stage. His heart was pounding in his chest, but there was a sense of calm that settled over him. This was what he had been fighting for: the people who needed to be heard. The people who had been overlooked, forgotten, or silenced by a broken system. He wasn't going to let them down. "Thank you all for being here today," Jake began, his voice steady but full of passion. "We're here because we know that the system isn't working for everyone. And it's time that we do something about it." He spoke for nearly an hour, outlining the changes they were pushing for and sharing the personal stories of those who had been impacted by the system. One by one, people took the microphone to share their experiences of injustice, inequality, and the pain of a broken system. The stories were raw, emotional, and heartbreaking. As Jake listened to their stories, he was reminded of why he started this journey in the first place. He had been one of the lucky ones. He had the chance to fight back, to change his story. But so many others hadn't been so fortunate. After the forum, the energy in the room was palpable. The crowd was fired up, ready to take action. There was no going back now. The movement had grown stronger, and Jake felt a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't just fighting for his own justice anymore. He was fighting for all of them. As Jake and Rachel packed up the event materials, Judge Warner called. "Jake, I've been hearing great things about the forum. The people are with you. But I have some bad news, too. Some of the lawmakers we've been working with are starting to back out. They're feeling the heat from the opposition." Jake's stomach sank. They had come so far, and now it seemed like it was all falling apart. But he wasn't ready to give up. "Not now. We can't let them win," Jake said firmly. "We have to keep pushing." Judge Warner's voice was steady. "I agree. It's time to ramp up our efforts. We need to keep the pressure on." Jake could feel the weight of the world pressing down on his shoulders. The forums had been a huge success, but with every victory came a new challenge. The opposition was fierce, and now, even the lawmakers who had seemed so supportive were beginning to waver. It wasn't just about public opinion anymore, it was about political power. And that power was being wielded against them. In the days following the forums, Jake, Judge Warner, and Rachel began working around the clock to solidify their efforts. They had gathered widespread public support, but now they needed to turn that into real political pressure. The petitions were growing in size, but Jake knew it wasn't enough. They needed to be heard in the halls of power. They needed to make sure their message couldn't be ignored. But with each step they took, the opposition grew more vocal. News outlets that had once praised Jake and the judge for their efforts now started to question their motives. Some suggested that their partnership was too controversial, others called their reform proposals radical, and a few even painted Jake as an opportunist using the judge's reputation to further his own agenda. It seemed like the more success they gained, the more the critics came out of the woodwork. At the same time, there was an increasing sense of unease within the political world. Jake received word that certain senators and representatives were feeling the heat from their more conservative colleagues, who were pulling strings behind the scenes to derail any real change. It was becoming clear that the justice system reform they were pushing for wasn't just unpopular, it was a direct threat to the interests of those in power. One afternoon, Jake sat in his apartment, staring at his phone. He had just received a call from a reporter who wanted to ask him about some controversial remarks made by a prominent figure within the legal community. The reporter insinuated that Jake's actions were anti-law enforcement and implied that his push for reform was undermining the integrity of the justice system. The frustration built up inside Jake, but he forced himself to take a deep breath. It was easy to feel overwhelmed. The media was turning against him, some of his allies were starting to second-guess their involvement, and the pressure from powerful figures was mounting. But Jake wasn't about to back down now. That night, Jake met with Rachel and Judge Warner at a local diner. They needed to regroup. They needed to figure out their next steps. "I've been getting calls from some lawmakers," Judge Warner said, sipping his coffee. "They're feeling the heat. Some of them are pulling back from our cause." Jake clenched his fists under the table, trying to remain calm. "We can't let them do this. We've come too far. We need to keep pushing." Rachel nodded. "The momentum is still there. We've got the people behind us. If we keep engaging with them, keep showing up in the communities, we can turn this around. But we need a plan. A big one." Jake leaned forward. "What do you mean?" "I'm talking about a national rally," Rachel said. "We need to make a statement that can't be ignored. A march. A rally. Something big that will get everyone's attention, politicians, the media, the public." Jake stared at her for a moment. The idea was bold. It was risky. But maybe it was exactly what they needed. "A rally could work," Jake said, his voice gaining confidence. "We need something to really hit home. We need to show that this isn't just a political issue, it's a human one." Judge Warner looked between them, clearly intrigued by the idea. "If we do this, we need to be strategic. We can't afford to look disorganized or make any missteps. It has to be flawless." They spent the rest of the evening discussing the logistics of the rally. They would need to secure permits, find speakers who could rally the crowd, and coordinate with activists across the country. But more than that, they needed to make sure that the message was clear: they were fighting for justice for everyone, not just for those who had been wronged by the system, but for the system itself. By the end of the night, Jake had made up his mind. "Let's do it. Let's plan this rally." The weeks that followed were a blur of planning, organizing, and campaigning. Jake and Rachel worked tirelessly, coordinating with activists, lawyers, and community leaders to spread the word about the rally. They wanted to make sure that the event wasn't just about them, it was about everyone who had been hurt by the system. Jake found himself traveling across the country, speaking at various rallies and meetings, spreading the message of criminal justice reform. He met people who shared their personal stories of injustice, families who had lost loved ones to the prison system, former inmates who had struggled to rebuild their lives, and even law enforcement officers who were frustrated by the flaws in the system they had sworn to uphold. As the rally date approached, the pressure began to mount. Jake was exhausted, both physically and emotionally. The weight of the movement felt heavier with each passing day. But through it all, he remained focused. He knew that this rally was their chance to make a final push, to remind everyone, lawmakers, the media, and the public, that the fight for justice wasn't over. The day before the rally, Jake sat alone in his hotel room, reflecting on everything that had led him to this moment. The path had been far from easy. He had faced ridicule, rejection, and countless obstacles along the way. But now, standing on the precipice of something bigger than himself, Jake realized that he had never truly been alone. He had Rachel, who had supported him from the beginning. He had Judge Warner, whose redemption story had become intertwined with Jake's own. And most importantly, he had the countless people whose lives had been affected by the same broken system, all of whom were depending on him to see this through. When Jake met up with Rachel the next morning, he could see the determination in her eyes. "We're ready for this," she said. Jake nodded. "We are. Let's show them what we're made of." The rally took place on the steps of the Capitol, with thousands of people showing up to demand justice. Activists, former prisoners, families, and concerned citizens gathered together in unity, holding signs, chanting slogans, and sharing stories. The atmosphere was electric, filled with a sense of hope and resolve. As Jake stood on stage, looking out at the massive crowd, he couldn't help but feel a sense of awe. They had done it. They had mobilized the people. And now, it was time for the lawmakers to hear them. The rally was everything Jake had hoped for, and more. The media coverage was massive. News outlets around the country broadcasted the event live, and for the first time in weeks, Jake felt like they had a real shot at making a lasting impact. The energy was electric, and it wasn't just the people in the crowd who felt it. Jake could sense that even the lawmakers who had been hesitant were starting to take notice. The speeches were powerful, stories of injustice, of lives ruined by a broken system. Families, activists, and legal experts took the stage, sharing their personal experiences and calling for reform. And then Jake stepped up. Standing before a sea of faces, the weight of their hope pressing down on him, Jake took a deep breath. He had prepared his speech carefully, but in this moment, it wasn't the words that mattered most, it was the feeling. The urgency. The undeniable need for change. "Today, we stand together," Jake began, his voice clear and unwavering. "Today, we raise our voices for the forgotten, for those who have been silenced by a broken system. This isn't just about us, it's about every single person who has been hurt, every life that has been torn apart because of a system that fails to serve justice." He paused, scanning the crowd. There were tears in some people's eyes, fists raised in others. The room was with him. "We're not here to ask for change. We're here to demand it. And we won't stop until we get it." The crowd erupted in applause, chanting his name. In that moment, Jake felt like they had finally crossed a line, like the momentum had shifted in their favor. The rally was only the beginning. Now, they had to turn that energy into real political action. But even as the crowd celebrated, Jake knew that the battle was far from over. The true test was yet to come. He had the people on his side, but he still needed the politicians to follow through. He needed them to stand up and make the changes that were so desperately needed. The following days were a blur. The rally had sparked renewed interest in the movement, and Jake received calls from lawmakers who had previously been silent. Some of them were asking tough questions about the specifics of the reform proposals. Others seemed more like they were trying to save face, offering half-hearted support while making it clear that they weren't yet fully on board. But it wasn't just the politicians who were watching. The media had turned its attention back to Jake's cause. Talk shows, podcasts, and news stations were all dissecting the rally, analyzing the speeches, and interviewing experts about the possibility of real reform. Some praised the movement, others questioned its feasibility. But the one thing they all agreed on was that Jake's campaign was making waves. And that was enough for now. One afternoon, as Jake and Rachel sat in their office, looking over the responses from lawmakers, Jake's phone buzzed. He glanced down at the screen and saw that it was Judge Warner. "I've got news," Jake answered the call, his voice tense. "There's been a breakthrough," Judge Warner said. "I just spoke with Senator Green. She's been one of the biggest opponents to our reforms, but after the rally, she's starting to shift. She's willing to meet with us next week to discuss some of the proposed changes." Jake's heart skipped a beat. Senator Green had been one of their fiercest critics. The fact that she was even considering meeting with them was a huge step forward. "That's great news," Jake said, trying to keep the excitement in check. "But we can't afford to take it easy now. We need to go in there with a solid plan." Rachel, who had been listening in, nodded. "We can't just talk about what needs to change. We need to show them how it can be done," how it will be done. Jake turned to her, a determined look on his face. Exactly. We're not going in there asking for favors. We're going in there with a solution. The meeting with Senator Green was scheduled for the following week. Jake, Rachel, and Judge Warner spent the next several days preparing, refining their proposals, and anticipating every possible objection. It was one thing to have the support of the people, it was another to have the support of the politicians who held the power to make real change. The day of the meeting arrived. Jake sat in the waiting room of the Senate office building, his nerves buzzing. This could be the moment that changed everything, or it could be just another dead end. He wasn't sure what to expect, but one thing was certain, he couldn't afford to fail. When they were finally called in, they were escorted into a sleek conference room where Senator Green was waiting. She was a tall, imposing woman with sharp features, and Jake had always found her cold and calculating. But today, her demeanor was different. She seemed less defensive, more open. "Mr. Thomas," Senator Green said, standing to shake his hand. "I have to admit, I didn't expect the rally to have such an impact. I've been following the media coverage, and I've spoken to several colleagues who attended. It seems like there's real momentum behind your cause." Jake took a seat across from her, his mind racing. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with us, Senator. We know that this issue is complex, but it's one that can't be ignored any longer. We have a chance to fix what's broken. We can't afford to wait." Rachel spoke up next. "We've put together a comprehensive proposal for criminal justice reform. We've looked at what's worked in other states, we've listened to the voices of those affected, and we believe this is the path forward. We're not asking for radical change, we're asking for necessary change." Senator Green listened intently, nodding as they laid out their plan. For the first time in the conversation, Jake saw a flicker of hesitation in her eyes. She was listening, not just to the words, but to the urgency behind them. As the meeting continued, it became clear that there was a genuine willingness to compromise. They didn't win her over completely, but they did make significant progress. Senator Green agreed to back some of the reforms in exchange for further discussions on how they would be implemented. It wasn't the full victory Jake had hoped for, but it was a start. As they left the meeting, Jake could hardly believe it. They had made progress. Senator Green hadn't completely endorsed everything they wanted, but she had taken a step toward supporting the movement. This was the first real sign that their efforts were starting to bear fruit. "We did it," Rachel said, smiling. "This is the breakthrough we needed." Jake couldn't help but smile back. The road ahead was still long, but this was the first sign of real, tangible progress. And he was more determined than ever to see it through. After the meeting with Senator Green, Jake felt a cautious optimism settle over him. They had made some headway, but he knew better than to think they had won the war. The political landscape was volatile, and every step forward seemed to lead to a dozen new obstacles. For every ally they gained, there seemed to be a dozen more ready to oppose them at every turn. The real battle wasn't just with the lawmakers, it was with the system itself. Back at the office, Rachel and Jake sifted through the latest responses from other politicians. Some were more favorable than others, but there was a growing undercurrent of resistance that Jake couldn't ignore. In the wake of the rally and their recent successes, the opposition had become quieter but more strategic. While the media buzzed with excitement and a handful of senators seemed open to change, there were powerful forces working behind the scenes to block their progress. The opposition wasn't just about conservative lawmakers anymore, it was about the entrenched interests that relied on the current system to maintain their power. There were corporate interests tied to the private prison industry, lobbyists with deep pockets, and powerful figures who had a stake in keeping things the way they were. These forces operated quietly, behind closed doors, pulling strings and influencing the political process in ways that were hard to detect. It wasn't until Jake received an anonymous tip about a closed-door meeting between several senators and corporate lobbyists that he began to connect the dots. The rally had sparked some public support, but it had also put a target on his back. There were whispers that if he and his allies continued to push too hard, the opposition would retaliate, not through direct confrontation, but by sabotaging the reforms from the shadows. Jake had always known that this fight wasn't going to be easy. But now, he realized just how deep the corruption ran. The next few days were filled with more strategy sessions. Jake, Rachel, and Judge Warner knew they had to be more tactical. They couldn't afford to rely on public support alone. They needed to outmaneuver the forces that were quietly working against them. And they needed to be prepared for the fact that their opponents were going to get even more creative in their attempts to derail the reform. One evening, after a long day of meetings, Rachel sat down with Jake in their office to discuss their next move. She looked exhausted, her eyes dark circles under them, but there was a determination in her expression that kept Jake going. "We need to start looking at our allies more closely," Rachel said, her voice steady. "Some of these senators, they might say the right things, but are they really going to stand by us when it counts? We need to figure out who is genuinely with us, and who is just trying to play both sides." Jake nodded, leaning back in his chair. "You're right. We can't afford any more surprises. We need to know who we can trust." That was the moment when they decided to go on the offensive. They couldn't just wait for the system to respond, they needed to take the fight directly to their opponents. If the opposition was going to work in the shadows, then they would shine a light on them. They began gathering intel on the key figures who had been blocking their progress. Rachel pulled together a team of researchers to dig into the financial ties of the senators and lobbyists who had been fighting the reforms. They started reaching out to whistleblowers, activists, and insiders who could provide information about the underhanded tactics being used against them. It wasn't long before they uncovered something shocking: several high-ranking members of Congress had financial ties to the private prison industry. Some had received significant donations from prison lobbyists, while others had direct business interests in companies that profited from mass incarceration. The web of influence was more complex than they had initially imagined, and the realization hit Jake like a punch to the gut. They had known that the private prison industry was a powerful force in American politics, but the extent of its reach was staggering. It wasn't just about making money, it was about keeping a broken system alive. And those who were profiting from the status quo were willing to do whatever it took to maintain their grip on power. Over the next few weeks, Jake and Rachel worked tirelessly to expose these connections. They knew that the media would be their biggest ally in this fight. If they could make the public aware of the influence that these corporate interests had on their lawmakers, it could spark a nationwide outcry. But they also knew that they had to tread carefully. They couldn't afford to be seen as just another group throwing accusations around, they needed hard evidence and a clear message. The breakthrough came when a whistleblower, a former lobbyist who had worked for one of the largest private prison companies, contacted Rachel. The whistleblower had insider knowledge about a secret meeting where several senators had been offered bribes in exchange for blocking criminal justice reform. It was the smoking gun they had been waiting for. Jake knew that this information could turn the tide, but it also put them in even greater danger. If they moved too quickly, they could be seen as attacking the very system they were trying to change. If they moved too slowly, the opposition might have time to bury the story. They decided to go public. Rachel worked with a trusted journalist to break the story, providing all the evidence they had gathered: correspondence between the senators and private prison executives, financial records, and testimonies from insiders. The story hit the news like a bombshell, sending shockwaves through the political world. The media coverage was intense. The story was everywhere, on the front page of newspapers, on TV news stations, and trending online. The public was outraged. It wasn't just about the politicians anymore, it was about the corruption that had been allowed to fester for decades. People were demanding answers, and they were demanding change. But even as the public rallied behind them, Jake knew that the fight was far from over. The opposition would fight back. They always did. But now, they had the upper hand. The story had put the issue of private prisons into the spotlight, and the senators who had been working with them were facing increasing pressure to explain their actions. Jake sat in his office, staring at the news reports. The world was watching. This was their moment. The next few days would be critical. Would the political system respond to the public outcry, or would the forces of corruption manage to suppress the truth? Rachel walked in, her phone buzzing in her hand. "Jake, you're not going to believe this. I just got off the phone with Senator Green. She's ready to support us, fully. She says she's willing to make a public statement calling for an investigation into the corruption we uncovered." Jake's eyes widened. "Are you serious?" Rachel nodded, a smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "It looks like the tide's finally turning." Jake couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. They had done it. They had exposed the corruption, and now, the momentum was on their side. The following weeks were a whirlwind of media interviews, strategic meetings, and behind-the-scenes maneuvering. The bombshell report on the corruption tied to private prisons had sent shockwaves through the political landscape. As Jake and Rachel had hoped, public outcry reached a fever pitch, and more lawmakers began to speak out against the system they had once supported. Even Senator Green, the woman who had been so staunchly opposed to the reforms, had turned her stance around and now stood alongside Jake, demanding an investigation into the links between politicians and the private prison industry. However, with every victory, Jake felt the pressure building. It wasn't just the media or the public eye that he had to worry about. As their movement gained momentum, so did the opposition. The very forces they were fighting against were more determined than ever to protect their interests, and they were beginning to fight back in ways that Jake hadn't anticipated. It was late one evening when Rachel received a phone call that would change everything. "Jake, you need to hear this," she said, rushing into his office with her phone in hand, her face pale. Jake's stomach tightened at the urgency in her voice. He took the phone from her, his heart racing. "Rachel, what's going on?" "It's not good," she said, her voice trembling. "We've been hacked. Someone got into our files, everything. They have everything we've been working on, the financial records, the whistleblower testimonies, even the evidence of the bribes from the private prison companies. They've got it all." Jake's blood ran cold. The evidence they had painstakingly gathered, the information that had given them their leverage in the fight, was now in the hands of their enemies. Whoever had orchestrated the hack could use it to discredit them, turn the tables, and destroy everything they had worked for. "How bad is it?" Jake asked, trying to steady his breath. Rachel's hands shook as she scanned the screen. "They've uploaded the files to a secure server. It's already being disseminated to the wrong people. We need to move fast if we want to keep this from blowing up in our faces." Jake slammed his fist on the desk, frustration boiling over. How the hell did they get in? Rachel's eyes narrowed. It's not just a random hack. This was targeted. Someone knew exactly where to look. It didn't take long for Jake to realize the magnitude of the situation. This wasn't just a breach of privacy, it was an all-out assault on their movement. Their opponents were willing to go to extreme lengths to protect their interests, even if it meant trying to destroy Jake and his team in the process. The next few days were a blur of frantic phone calls, sleepless nights, and frantic attempts to secure the stolen files. Jake and Rachel worked tirelessly with cybersecurity experts to trace the breach and prevent further leaks. But it was clear that whoever was behind the hack was playing dirty, using the stolen information to manipulate public perception. The media began reporting on the hack, focusing not on the corruption they had uncovered, but on the potential breach of security within Jake's campaign. They painted a picture of a movement that was riddled with leaks and mismanagement, suggesting that Jake and his team were incompetent at best and untrustworthy at worst. The narrative began to shift, and suddenly, the public's perception of their cause was under threat. Jake felt his resolve begin to crack. They had been so close. Now, everything they had worked for seemed to be unraveling in front of their eyes. The truth they had fought so hard to expose was being overshadowed by scandal and accusations. But Jake wasn't ready to give up. "We can't let them control the narrative," Jake said, standing tall despite the heavy weight pressing down on him. "We've come this far, and we're not backing down now." Rachel nodded, her expression hardening. "We need to take back control. We have to show people that this hack isn't going to stop us." Jake knew that the only way to regain the upper hand was to go directly to the public. If the media was going to focus on the hack, then they would expose it for what it was, a desperate, underhanded attempt to silence the truth. That evening, Jake scheduled a live broadcast to address the nation. He wasn't just going to explain the hack, he was going to turn it into a rallying cry. As the broadcast began, Jake's face appeared on screens across the country. He looked directly into the camera, his voice steady and firm, despite the storm raging around him. "Good evening, America. Tonight, I come before you not as a politician or a lawyer, but as a concerned citizen. A citizen who believes that justice should be for everyone, not just for those who can afford it. A citizen who has fought to expose the truth about a broken system. But tonight, I'm here to tell you that the truth is under attack, because we're getting too close to uncovering the truth behind a corrupt system that has been in place for far too long." He paused, taking a deep breath. Someone who profits from this broken system, has decided to hack into our campaign. They've stolen our files, our research, our evidence. They think this will silence us. They think this will make us stop. But let me be clear, it will not. We will not be intimidated. We will not be silenced. We will expose the truth, no matter the cost. Jake's words were a call to arms, a declaration that the movement was far from over. He knew that this was a dangerous game, but it was the only one left to play. If they could expose the hack for what it was, a cowardly attempt to stop the reform, then they could reclaim their momentum. The broadcast went viral within minutes. Social media was abuzz with people rallying behind Jake. The message was clear: the fight for justice wasn't just about the reform anymore, it was about protecting the truth, no matter how ugly or uncomfortable it was. Over the next few days, the public response was overwhelmingly supportive. People saw the hack for what it was, a desperate attempt by the opposition to stop a movement they couldn't control. The media began shifting their coverage, once again focusing on the corruption Jake had exposed. News outlets that had previously been skeptical of the movement now began reporting on the strength and resilience Jake had shown in the face of adversity. But despite the public support, Jake knew that the hardest part of the fight was still ahead. The opposition wouldn't back down just because of a little bad press, they were more powerful than ever. The stakes had never been higher. Jake and his team knew they had to stay one step ahead. The hack had been their wake-up call. Now, more than ever, they had to be vigilant. Jake sat in his office late that night, staring at the glowing screen of his laptop. The public outcry from the hack had turned the tides in their favor for the moment, but the reality of the situation still hung heavily in the air. The opposition wasn't going to stop. They had far more resources at their disposal and a long history of knowing how to fight dirty. The movement was in the spotlight now, but that spotlight could just as easily turn into a blinding glare. Despite the setbacks, Jake knew one thing for certain: they were on the right side of history. He could feel the shift in the air, a change that came from the people, the everyday Americans who were tired of the injustice, who were fed up with a system that seemed to favor the wealthy and powerful. The momentum was there, and Jake and his team had to capitalize on it before they lost it entirely. But how? He leaned back in his chair, deep in thought. Every strategy they'd used so far had been reactive. The hack, the media battles, the political pushback, it was all a defense. Now, they needed something bold. Something that would make the opposition unable to ignore them. Rachel entered the room with a stack of papers in her hand. She looked weary, but her eyes still burned with determination. "Jake, I've been going over the numbers. We've got a lot of public support, but we need to harness it more effectively. We can't just rely on the media anymore. We need a direct way to engage people and keep the pressure on. Jake nodded slowly. You're right. The media won't carry our water forever. If we want to keep the momentum going, we need to find a way to make the people feel like they are a part of this. A part of the change. Rachel placed the papers on his desk and opened them. Here's what I was thinking. We organize a national campaign, something bold, something that gives the people a way to voice their support. A massive petition. But not just any petition, a living, breathing movement that can't be ignored. Jake's eyebrows rose. A petition? Not just a petition. A pledge. A commitment. A way for people to say, I stand for justice. I stand against the corrupt system. Rachel's voice picked up speed as she warmed to the idea. We could set up booths in major cities, allow people to physically sign, and we could stream it all live, creating a nationwide event. It's not just a petition, it's a statement of unity. And it would create a clear, undeniable image of how many people want reform. Jake's heart raced at the idea. This wasn't just a petition, it was a rallying cry. The kind of bold action that could make their movement impossible to ignore. It wasn't just about signatures, it was about giving the people a voice, giving them power. I love it, Jake said, standing up from his desk. Let's make it happen. This is the push we need. The next several days were a whirlwind of planning and organizing. Jake, Rachel, and the rest of the team coordinated with local organizers, hired volunteers, and spread the word through social media and traditional outlets. The goal was clear, they needed to mobilize thousands, if not millions, of people to show up in person, sign the pledge, and send a message to Congress that reform was no longer just a dream, it was a demand. The event was scheduled to take place in 10 major cities across the country, with live streaming set up to connect everyone involved. The centerpiece would be the Capitol, where Jake himself would be standing, watching as people came to make their pledge in person. The event would coincide with the anniversary of the rally that had first brought attention to the issue, adding to its symbolic weight. The day of the National Pledge campaign arrived, and the energy was electric. Everywhere Jake turned, he saw people lining up, eager to participate. At the Capitol, thousands of supporters gathered, holding signs, chanting, and waiting to sign the pledge. The crowds were a mix of ages, backgrounds, and walks of life, proof that this movement had struck a chord with the nation. Jake stood at the podium, flanked by Rachel and Judge Warner, watching the sea of faces before him. This is it, Rachel said under her breath, her voice filled with both awe and determination. Jake nodded. This is our moment. The live stream was on, and millions of people across the country were watching, their eyes trained on Jake as he took the microphone. Today, we stand together, Jake began, his voice booming through the speakers. Today, we say, no more. No more to a broken system. No more to a system that only works for the rich and powerful. We're here to demand justice. We're here to demand change. And we won't stop until we get it. The crowd erupted in applause, their voices rising in a unified roar. Jake's heart swelled with emotion. He had always believed in the power of the people, but seeing it in action, hearing the chants, seeing the signs, was something else entirely. One by one, people came forward, signing the pledge, their voices and their commitment strengthening the movement. Jake could feel the energy shifting, a sense of unstoppable momentum building in the air. This wasn't just about a petition, it was about the birth of something much bigger. As the day went on, the pledge campaign became more than just a rally. It was a nationwide conversation. News outlets reported on the overwhelming turnout, and the hashtag #JusticeForAll trended on social media. The opposition tried to discredit the event, claiming that it was a stunt or an orchestrated show. But the numbers didn't lie. Hundreds of thousands of people were signing on to this cause, and they weren't going away. That night, after the event wrapped up, Jake and Rachel sat in the hotel room, exhausted but exhilarated. The entire country had seen the movement for what it was, a call for justice, for reform, for equality. Rachel smiled as she looked at Jake. "I think we've crossed the tipping point. There's no going back now." Jake nodded, his gaze distant. "We've started something that can't be undone. But it's not over. The fight has only just begun." But even as the movement reached new heights, Jake knew there would be consequences. The forces they were up against wouldn't give up easily. They would find new ways to fight back, new ways to undermine their progress. But Jake wasn't afraid. This was bigger than any one person or group, it was a fight for the future of the country. And he would keep fighting until the last breath. As Jake stood on the balcony of his hotel room that evening, overlooking the glowing city skyline, he couldn't shake the feeling that they had crossed a threshold, a turning point where things would never be the same. The crowds at the pledge campaign had been overwhelming, the support from across the country undeniable. People were waking up to the truth, and they were demanding change. It was exhilarating, but it was also terrifying. The weight of what lay ahead was pressing down on him. It wasn't just about continuing to expose corruption or rallying the public, it was about surviving the inevitable retaliation that was sure to come. The forces they were fighting against were powerful, and they would stop at nothing to protect their interests. He glanced over at Rachel, who was scrolling through her phone, reading the latest media updates. She caught his gaze and smiled, but there was a tension in her eyes that Jake couldn't ignore. "You okay?" she asked softly. Jake sighed, rubbing his temples. "I'm not sure. I feel like we've made a breakthrough, but it's like we're standing on the edge of a cliff. If we go too far, there's no turning back." Rachel nodded. "I get it. But look at the people out there." She gestured toward the city streets below, where the aftermath of the pledge campaign was still rippling through the crowds. "They're with us. They won't stop fighting. And neither should we." Jake smiled faintly. "You're right. But it's not just the people we have to worry about anymore. We're going to need every bit of strength we have to push through this. And that means making tough decisions." The next few days were filled with strategy meetings and calls to key allies. Jake and Rachel had to act fast. The momentum from the pledge campaign was strong, but the opposition was already regrouping. They had to stay ahead, and the next move would be crucial. One of the first pieces of business was securing the backing of key politicians. Senator Green, who had once been a staunch opponent of the reforms, had come around after the success of the pledge campaign, but Jake knew it would take more than her support to make lasting change. They needed a coalition, a united front of lawmakers, activists, and advocates who could push for reform on all fronts. Jake sat in a meeting with Green, his other supporters, and Rachel, who had become his closest ally and trusted strategist. "I think we've made incredible progress," Jake said, "but it's going to take more than just public pressure. We need legislative action. We need laws that will dismantle the private prison industry and hold those who profit from it accountable." Green, who had seemed weary at first, now looked more confident, her eyes gleaming with determination. "I agree. We can't let this momentum fizzle out. The public wants change, and we have the opportunity to make it happen. But we'll need to push hard, there's still resistance in Congress. People who are paid to keep the system going." Rachel leaned forward, her voice steady. "We've built a coalition of voters. Now we need to translate that into legislative action. We need bipartisan support, even if it's just for the basics." Green nodded. "I'll get to work on that. But I need to be clear, this won't be easy. It's a fight that could last for months, even years. And along the way, there will be moments when it feels like everything is falling apart." Jake met her gaze, his resolve hardening. "We've already come this far. We're not backing down now." For the next few weeks, the battle intensified. Jake's team worked tirelessly to coordinate with other activists, lobbyists, and political figures to draft new legislation aimed at dismantling the private prison system. They held rallies, conducted interviews, and continued to push the public narrative forward. But the opposition, well-funded and entrenched in the system, wasn't about to give up without a fight. Behind closed doors, there were whispers of smear campaigns and attempts to discredit Jake and his team. Media outlets, some of which had once been in his corner, began running stories casting doubt on his leadership, questioning the validity of the evidence they had uncovered. There were rumors of mysterious donors funneling money into opposing campaigns, trying to sway public opinion and influence politicians. Jake felt the pressure mounting, but he also knew that retreat wasn't an option. He knew there would be sacrifices. The road ahead would be grueling and uncertain. But every time he thought about giving up, he remembered the faces of those who had signed the pledge, the people whose lives depended on the success of their movement. They were counting on him, and he couldn't turn back now. One night, after a particularly grueling day of meetings, Jake found himself sitting alone in the campaign office, his head in his hands. The weight of it all was suffocating. He had always prided himself on being able to handle pressure, to navigate the complexities of law and politics with skill and determination. But this was different. This fight wasn't just for a case or a client, it was for an entire system to change. And sometimes, the enormity of it all felt like too much. Rachel knocked softly on the door before entering. She could see the exhaustion in his eyes and the tension in his posture. "Jake, we've come a long way. You're not alone in this." Jake looked up, his face weary but resolute. "I know. But sometimes it feels like the more we push, the harder it gets. We've fought so hard to expose the truth, but I keep wondering, what if it's not enough?" Rachel crossed the room and sat beside him, her tone gentle but firm. "I get that fear. But the thing is, we're not fighting for the truth alone. We're fighting for the people. And they're the ones who are going to carry us through this." Jake looked at her, his eyes reflecting the same weariness. "I don't know if I'm ready for what's coming next." "You don't have to be ready," she said. "You just have to keep going. We all do. We've made it this far, and we can make it further. Together." Jake nodded slowly, the weight of her words sinking in. They weren't in this alone. He wasn't in this alone. The next morning, as Jake and Rachel stood together at a press conference to announce their next push in Congress, Jake's nerves were still on edge. The media cameras flashed, and reporters shouted questions from every angle, but he steadied himself, finding strength in Rachel's presence beside him. "This is a moment," Jake said, addressing the crowd. "It's the moment we've been fighting for. But we can't stop now. We've exposed the corruption. We've mobilized the people. And now we need to ensure that justice is done. This is bigger than any one of us. This is for everyone who has been affected by a broken system. And we will not stop until we see change." The crowd erupted in applause, the energy in the air palpable. For the first time in weeks, Jake felt the surge of hope, the belief that the impossible could be achieved if they kept pushing forward. The days following the press conference felt like a whirlwind. The national movement was gathering even more steam. News stories were airing non-stop, covering the pledges, the politicians involved, and the public's growing demands for change. Jake and his team had ignited a fire, and there was no turning it off. But as the movement spread, so did the resistance. The power brokers, those whose fortunes and influence were tied to the system they were trying to dismantle, weren't going to let this go easily. Jake spent every waking moment strategizing with Rachel and his team. They had to stay ahead of the game, anticipate the next move. Every victory felt fragile, as though a single misstep could bring everything crashing down. In the midst of this constant pressure, Jake had a conversation with Senator Green, whose support had been invaluable. She was at the forefront of pushing their legislation through Congress, but Jake could see the toll it was taking on her. She had always been a pragmatic politician, but even she was beginning to feel the weight of the fight. "Jake, Green said one afternoon after a strategy meeting, her voice thick with concern, "This isn't just about us anymore. This is about everyone who's been wronged by the system, the people whose lives are in the balance. But the pressure from the other side? It's unlike anything I've ever dealt with." Jake looked at her, his expression grim. "I know. The stakes are higher than ever now. But we can't back down. Not now." She nodded, her eyes hardening with resolve. "We won't back down. But there's a new player in the game now. Someone with the resources and power to disrupt everything." Jake's stomach twisted. "Who?" Green leaned in, her voice lowering. "Senator Bradley Westmore. He's a major player in the private prison industry. His ties go deep. He's been funding opposition groups, and he's already pulled strings to block us from getting votes in key committees. We're going to have to fight him, and we're going to have to fight dirty. If we don't, we risk losing everything." Jake clenched his fists. This was the kind of fight he'd been dreading, the kind of fight where the rules didn't apply. But it was also the fight they needed to win. Later that evening, Jake and Rachel sat in their campaign office, staring at the papers spread out before them. They had been working non-stop for days, trying to keep up with the barrage of opposition, all while preparing for the next round of hearings in Congress. Every strategy, every angle they had planned, was now at risk of being crushed by Westmore's influence. Rachel was the first to speak. "We have to hit him where it hurts. If we can't beat him in Congress, we have to beat him in the public eye. We need to expose his connections to the private prison industry. People don't know the depths of his involvement. If we make it public, he won't just be a political enemy, he'll be the face of everything that's wrong with the system." Jake nodded, his mind racing. "We need hard evidence, something undeniable. Something that'll make the public demand action. I think we're going to have to dig deeper than we've ever dug before." Rachel sat up straighter, her eyes sharp. "We need someone on the inside. We need someone who has direct access to his operations. We need someone who can give us the smoking gun we're looking for." Jake thought about it for a long moment, then shook his head. "I know just the person." The next day, Jake and Rachel arranged a meeting with an old friend, Tom Alvarez, a former aide to one of Westmore's political allies. Tom had left his job after uncovering shady dealings within the senator's circle, and he had been living under the radar ever since. But he was still connected, and Jake knew if anyone could help them expose Westmore, it was Tom. They met in a quiet cafe, far from prying eyes. Jake could see the unease in Tom's eyes as he sat down, glancing around nervously. "You know why we're here, Tom," Jake said softly. "We need information on Westmore. We need to expose his ties to the private prison industry before he can crush everything we've worked for." Tom hesitated, running his fingers through his hair. "I know you're fighting for a good cause, Jake. But this isn't just a political battle. Westmore is dangerous. He has resources. He has people who will do whatever it takes to protect him." Rachel leaned in, her voice steady. "We understand that. But we don't have a choice. If we don't do something now, he'll take us down before we even have a chance to finish what we started." Tom stared at the table, clearly wrestling with the decision. Finally, he looked up, his eyes filled with both fear and determination. "I've got something. A document, a series of communications between Westmore and several private prison CEOs. It's damning. It shows direct collusion, bribery, the works. If you release this, Westmore will be finished. But I can't do it alone. You'll need to keep me safe. And once it's out, there's no going back." Jake's pulse quickened. This was the breakthrough they needed, the evidence that could turn the tide. "We'll protect you. Whatever it takes." Tom slid a flash drive across the table, his hands shaking slightly. "Just remember, this won't just be a fight for reform anymore. This will be war. That evening, Jake and Rachel reviewed the documents Tom had given them. It was more than they could have hoped for, communications that showed not only bribery and kickbacks, but also plans to use political influence to shape legislation in favor of the private prison industry. It was the smoking gun they had been searching for. But as they stared at the evidence in front of them, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of a much darker struggle. Exposing Westmore would be a major blow to the opposition, but it would also escalate the fight to a whole new level. The powers they were up against had already shown they weren't afraid to play dirty. Now, it seemed like the gloves were coming off for good. "Rachel," Jake said, his voice low, "we're about to enter the heart of the storm. This isn't just about reform anymore. It's about survival." Rachel nodded, her gaze unwavering. "We've come too far to stop now. We fight. And we win." The morning sun filtered through the windows of the campaign office, casting long shadows on the walls. Jake stood in front of the large map of the country that had been pinned up for months, dots marking cities, counties, key politicians, and support rallies. But today, it felt different. Today, the map wasn't just a strategy board. It felt like a battleground. Jake couldn't help but feel the pressure building. He and Rachel had come a long way, but the final showdown was at hand. Westmore had already begun a full-on assault. He had hired a PR firm to discredit their findings, accusing them of fabricating evidence, twisting the truth, and using political power for personal gain. The media, once on their side, was now divided. Some outlets supported their cause, while others, those funded by wealthy donors and corporations with ties to the prison system, attacked them relentlessly. This was no longer just about reform, it was a fight for survival. A fight that would determine whether the truth could survive against a system that had been built to protect itself at all costs. Rachel walked into the office, holding a phone to her ear, her expression serious. As she hung up, she met Jake's gaze. "The committee vote is tomorrow. We need all the support we can get. But they're tightening the pressure, congressional leaders are wavering. They're getting cold feet." Jake felt the weight of her words. They had come so far. They had exposed corruption, rallied the public, and even gotten some allies in Washington. But with the opposition closing in, it wasn't clear how much longer they could hold out. "Then we have no choice but to push harder," Jake said, his voice filled with determination. "If we can't win with the facts, then we'll win with the truth. We need to get the word out, get people to flood Congress with calls, emails, and letters. If the people stand with us, they won't be able to ignore it." Rachel nodded. "I'll make the calls. You focus on the final speech." Jake turned back to the map, his mind racing. The final speech was everything. It needed to galvanize the country, mobilize the people, and push Congress to act. But it also had to expose the full scale of the corruption they were up against. The truth wasn't enough anymore, they had to make it impossible to ignore. The next day, the team gathered in the small conference room, preparing for the rally. It was the moment they had all been working toward, the climax of a months-long campaign that had brought them to this point. The room buzzed with nervous energy, but beneath it all, there was a sense of unity. They knew what they were up against, and they knew what they had to do. Jake stood at the front, looking at the faces of his team, his allies, his friends. "This is it. This is the fight for justice, for all the families whose lives have been torn apart by the prison system. For everyone who's been silenced, ignored, and pushed aside by a corrupt system. But this fight isn't just about us. It's about them, the people. We've made it clear that the system is broken. We've shown the evidence, we've rallied the public, and now we're going to show Congress that the people will no longer stand by and let this go on." The team clapped, their faces filled with resolve. Jake looked at Rachel, who was standing at the back of the room. She gave him a small nod of encouragement. The rally was set to take place just outside the Capitol. Jake stood in front of the microphone, looking out at the sea of people gathered in the street. Cameras flashed from every direction. His heart pounded in his chest, but he kept his composure. This was the moment where everything could change. The crowd was packed tightly, chanting and waving signs. The energy was electric. Fight for justice. End the prison industrial complex. The truth will set us free. Jake took a deep breath and stepped up to the podium, the weight of the moment settling in. My friends, we are here today because we are not afraid, he began. We are not afraid of the powerful, of the corrupt, or of the ones who seek to silence us. We are here because we refuse to let this broken system continue any longer. For too long, we've allowed private corporations to profit off the pain of our people. For too long, families have been torn apart and lives have been destroyed, all for the sake of a system that doesn't care about justice. Today, we stand united to say enough is enough. The crowd erupted in applause. For months, we've been fighting to expose the truth, Jake continued, his voice rising with passion. We've uncovered the corruption at the highest levels. We've shown the connections between politicians, corporations, and prison CEOs who have used their influence to create a system that profits from locking people up, no matter the cost. But this fight is far from over. Tomorrow, Congress will vote on a bill that could change everything. This vote could end the era of private prisons, or it could allow it to continue for another generation. The people of this country have spoken. The people have demanded justice. And now, we need Congress to hear us. The crowd cheered, and Jake's heart swelled with hope. But he knew that the battle wasn't over yet. The real challenge lay ahead. The next day, in a small, packed hearing room, Jake sat nervously with Rachel by his side. The Senate Committee on Justice Reform was meeting to discuss the bill. His stomach churned with anxiety. This was the moment that would decide everything, the moment that would either bring them closer to victory or shatter their dreams. The senators began their deliberations, with some members praising the bill's potential to create real change, while others voiced their concerns about the economic impact. Jake knew they were running out of time, and he couldn't sit quietly. It was now or never. He stood up, his heart pounding. Chairman, members of the committee, he said, his voice steady despite the nerves. For too long, we've allowed corporations to profit off of the suffering of our people. We've turned a blind eye to the reality of a broken prison system, where lives are destroyed, families are torn apart, and justice is nothing more than a commodity. Today, we have a choice. We can either continue to allow this system to thrive, or we can choose a future where justice truly means justice for all. Jake's voice rang out in the room, and the silence that followed was deafening. The committee members exchanged nervous glances, and the weight of the decision hung in the air. Then, after a long pause, Senator Green stood up. I've seen the evidence, I've heard the voices of the people, and I believe that it's time for us to take action. I'm in favor of this bill. One by one, the other senators followed suit. The vote was close, but in the end, the bill passed. Jake stood there, stunned, as the room erupted in applause. They had done it. They had won. Later that night, as Jake and Rachel stood in front of the Capitol building, looking out at the darkened streets, they shared a moment of quiet reflection. It's over, Jake said, his voice soft with awe. We did it. Rachel smiled, her eyes glistening. No, Jake. This is just the beginning. Jake nodded, understanding now that their fight wasn't over. The road ahead would still be long, filled with challenges, obstacles, and setbacks. But one thing was clear, they had won a battle, and the truth was on their side. And together, they would continue to fight. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. What do you think of the victory? Was this the end of the fight, or is the battle for justice just beginning? The movement has won a huge victory today, but there's still much work to be done. Stay tuned for the next chapter in the fight for freedom.